The wind had teeth that night. It didn't just bite, it gnawed, right down to the bone, right down to the last sliver of a man's hope. Maddox shoved his way through it, his old mule trudging behind him, the mountain trail lost somewhere under a foot of fresh, angry snow. He didn't have a lantern. It had given up miles back. All he had was the memory of the path, a ghost of a trail winding past pines that bent over like they were praying. He wasn't looking for shelter. Men like him, men with ghosts in their eyes, they didn't get offered shelter anymore. They got suspicion. They got locked doors. His boots were heavy with slush, each step a fight. Then he smelled it. Not pine, not wet earth. Smoke, clean and sharp. Cedar wood. Someone had a fire going. Up ahead, a cabin. Every instinct screamed at him to keep walking. What kind of man shows up in the middle of a blizzard, empty-handed and half-frozen, and knocks on a stranger's door? What right did he have? But the mule, she didn't wait for him. She turned toward the smoke like she smelled home, like she knew something he didn't. So he followed. A roof appeared through the swirling snow, a dark shape against the white, a small cabin half swallowed by the woods. The wind shrieked past its chimney, a high, lonesome sound. He got closer, slow, listening. There was nothing. No voices, no footsteps, just the fire, a faint crackle from inside. He knocked. The sound was swallowed by the storm. He knocked again, harder. Nothing. He put his shoulder to the door and pushed. It wasn't locked. It groaned open, and a wave of weak, struggling heat washed over him. The room was dark, lit only by the faint orange glow of a wood stove. And at first, he thought it was empty. Then his eyes adjusted to the gloom. And he saw her. She was lying on the floor near the hearth, curled up like an animal trying to protect its soft belly. Her dress was soaked through, her hair a tangled mess across her face. But that wasn't the first thing he noticed. The first thing he noticed was the chain. A thick, rusted length of it ran from her arms, stretched above her head, to a heavy iron bolt driven deep into the stonework behind the stove. And she was bleeding. Maddox froze in the doorway, snow melting in pools around his boots. This wasn't some robbery gone wrong. This wasn't a drunkard's fury. This was something else, something cold and deliberate and evil. The woman stirred, a tiny movement, a flicker of life in the shadows. Her eyes opened, but they were unfocused, glassy. A whisper, so quiet he almost missed it, slid from her lips. "Don't, call the sheriff." Her voice was thin, brittle as ice on a frozen creek. Maddox moved without thinking, dropping to one knee beside her. The heat from the stove didn't seem to touch her. Her skin was like cold stone. "Water," she breathed, trying to push herself up. She let out a sharp gasp, a sound of pure agony that twisted something in his gut. And that's when he saw it. The dress wasn't just soaked with snow and filth. It was dark with blood. And beneath the fabric her body was straining, convulsing. "My God," he breathed, the words coming out as a puff of white vapor. "You're in labor." She managed a weak nod before her head fell back against the rough floorboards. Her hands, shackled together, rattled the chain. I can't get loose," she sobbed. "He tied me, so I wouldn't leave." Maddox didn't ask who he was. The answer was a poison in the air. He scrambled to the stove, his eyes scanning the heavy bolt. It was sunk deep into the mortar. He wouldn't pry it loose. He saw a hatchet lying near the woodpile, its blade dull but heavy. He grabbed it. He swung once, the steel ringing against the iron bolt, sending sparks flying into the darkness. The bolt didn't budge. He swung again, harder, aiming not for the bolt itself, but for the wood and stone around it. A crack appeared. He swung a third time, putting every ounce of his strength, every bit of his rage into the blow. With a scream of tearing wood and splintering stone, the bolt ripped free. The chain fell to the floor with a heavy clang. The woman gasped, a sound not of pain, but of a prisoner taking their first breath of free air. He lifted her. He was more careful than he'd been with anything in his life, his rough hands suddenly gentle. He carried her to a thin straw mattress in the corner, the only soft thing in the entire cabin. "I don't have much," he said, his voice hoarse. "Blanket. Coffee." He took off his own thick coat, the one thing keeping him from freezing to death, and wrapped it around her shivering body. He stoked the fire, piling on wood until it roared back to life, hissing as the snow on his shoulders melted and dripped onto the hot iron. He worked with a grim purpose, finding a cracked jug and filling it with snow, setting it near the fire to melt. He found an old towel in a trunk and tore it into clean strips. He held the blade of his knife in the flames until it glowed red. He was just a man with a mule and a past full of ghosts, but in that moment, he was all this woman had. She stirred again. When she opened her eyes this time, they were clear. And there was something in them he hadn't seen before. Not fear, not pain. It was grit. The hard, sharp edge of someone who had learned long ago that begging for help was a waste of breath. "Name's Mercy," she said, her voice stronger now. "No one will come looking, not till it's over." He didn't ask what she meant by over. The desperate way she glanced at the door told him everything he needed to know. He offered her a sip of the warm, melted snow. "What's yours?" she asked, her breath catching as another contraction seized her. "Maddox," he said. "Folks call me Boone." A flicker of something crossed her face. Not a smile, not quite suspicion. "You from the town?" "I was, a long time ago." She cried out, her hand gripping the edge of his coat, her knuckles turning white. He took her wrist in his hand. It was small, bird-like, but her grip was like iron. "Breathe through it," he said. "I don't need help," she gasped, trying to pull away. He didn't let go. They stayed like that, his hand steady on her wrist, her breath coming in ragged gasps as 3 more waves of pain crashed over her. In the quiet lull between them, she whispered, her eyes searching his face. "Why are you helping me?" Maddox didn't answer for a long moment. He just stared into the fire at the dancing orange flames. Then he spoke, his voice so low she had to strain to hear it over the wind. "Because last time I didn't." Mercy's eyes widened. "You were there?" "No," he said, shaking his head. "But I heard the whispers, and I didn't ask questions. I just let it happen." She didn't reply, but he saw something in her change. A tension she'd been holding in her shoulders seemed to dissolve, just a little. The silence in the cabin was different now. It was warmer. He soaked a rag in the hot water and gently wiped the sweat from her brow. "You'll be all right," he said. "No one said that to me in months." "Then they're fools," he said, and for the first time she smiled. It was a small, fragile thing, but it was real. The firelight played on the walls, making shadows dance. And on the floor, the chain lay coiled like a dead snake, a reminder of the evil that had been in this room. "I heard him leave," she said suddenly, her voice flat. "The man who tied me here. He said he'd come back, once the baby was out. To take him." Maddox's jaw clenched so hard he felt a muscle jump in his cheek. "And you?" She looked away, toward the dark, rattling window. She didn't have to say it. He knew what would have happened to her. He threw another log on the fire, the sparks flying up the chimney like angry prayers. "You're not alone now," he said. She closed her eyes, her breathing slowing into a more regular rhythm. And for a long while, there was only the sound of the fire, the sigh of the storm, and the ticking of a clock that wasn't there, counting down the seconds until a new life arrived in this cold, cruel world. Maddox sat by the bed, a forgotten guardian angel in a world that had stopped believing in them, and he made a silent vow to the woman, to the fire, to whatever might be listening. I won't leave this time. The snow had stopped by morning, replaced by a deep, unnatural quiet. The wind had died down, but the air was still heavy, charged with unspoken things. Inside the cabin, the fire was a bed of glowing embers, but a stubborn warmth clung to the room, a warmth born of sweat and blood and sheer, bloody-minded survival. Maddox hadn't slept. He sat propped against the far wall, his coat still wrapped around the woman, watching the slow, steady rise and fall of her chest. He wasn't a man given to prayer, but watching her breathe felt like a kind of church. She was still here. That was the only miracle he needed. Mercy stirred, her hand moving to her stomach, which was still round and taut. The baby hadn't come yet. The storm inside her was just gathering its strength. She blinked, her eyes finding him in the dim light. "You're still here," she murmured, her voice raspy. A corner of his mouth twitched. "Didn't say I'd leave." "That's rare," she said. She turned her head, staring up at the rough-hewn timbers of the ceiling as if she could see the sky through them. "You should know the rest of it," she said, her voice gaining a new strength. "Before someone else tells it wrong." He gave a single slow nod. Mercy took a deep breath, not a shallow gasp of pain, but a long, deliberate inhale, like she was drawing up a story from the very bottom of her soul. "His name was Thatch Heller," she began. "Came up from Arizona Territory after the war. He had fast hands, a faster tongue, and boots so clean you could see your own sad face in them. Told everyone he was part Comanche, part preacher. He wasn't either." Maddox listened, his face unreadable. Her words fell into the silence, each one heavy with the weight of things left unsaid for too long. "I was 19. My husband, Elias, had been gone a year. Coughed his lungs out into a rag. The town buried him, brought me a condolence pie, and then they forgot I existed. Thatch saw that. He saw a woman alone, and to a man like him, alone means available." Her fingers found a loose thread on the blanket and began to twist it over and over. "He started small, offered to chop my firewood, came back the next day to fix a sagging fence post. Always talking about protection, how a woman like me couldn't last out here on her own, how the world was full of wolves." "Did he move in?" Maddox asked, his voice low. She let out a short, bitter laugh. "No, that would have been too honest. Instead, he started preaching in the town square, set himself up as a man of God, and he told everyone I was his poor, widowed cousin. He claimed I had the devil's eye, but a saint's womb. Can you believe that? Men who crave power, they can twist any holy book into the shape of a weapon." She paused, and Maddox poured some of the still warm water into a chipped cup and held it to her lips. She took a sip, her eyes never leaving the dying embers in the stove. "Then one night, he came here, stinking of whiskey. Said I owed him. For the wood, for the food, for the protection. I told him no. He said he'd take what was his anyway." Maddox didn't react, but a cold stillness settled over him. He'd seen this story play out before, in different towns, with different women. It always ended the same. "I fought him," Mercy continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I broke a plate over his head, cut his cheek open. He didn't go to the sheriff. He didn't have to. The next day, Sheriff Tobin showed up at my door, said he'd heard I was unstable, grieving too hard, stirring up trouble. The good people of the town were concerned." Maddox's jaw tightened. He knew that word. Concerned. It was the word people used right before they destroyed you, just to make themselves feel better about it. "They told me to leave," she said, her voice devoid of all emotion. "They said, If I couldn't live peacefully with decent folks, then I didn't belong. So I ran. I tried to anyway. I made it as far as the canyons, thinking I could have the baby in peace, start over somewhere new. But Thatch found me. She rolled onto her side, wincing as a fresh pain shot through her. He said I was carrying his child. He said he'd let me live, but he was taking the baby. Said I was tarnished goods now. He said no court in the territory would listen to the word of a hysterical woman who'd already run away once. Maddox stared into the fire, his hands clenching into fists. He thought of all the men he'd known with clean boots and a quick smile, men who offered to help, men who called themselves decent. He thought of all the ways a woman could be buried without a shovel ever touching the earth. And then he tied you, he said. It wasn't a question. Mercy nodded, a single tear finally escaping and tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. Said I'd birth it like an animal, alone and in the dark. Said he'd be back when it was done. A branch scraped against the cabin window, a sudden sharp sound that made them both jump. I should have died last night, she whispered. But you didn't. No, she said, and he saw that flicker of grit in her eyes again, stronger this time. You didn't let me. He looked away, back to the fire. I let someone else once, he said, his voice rough. Back in Texas, a young girl, new to town. She said a deputy forced himself on her. She had no family, no one to speak for her. We all called her a liar. It was easier than believing one of our own could be a monster. He held up his right hand, staring at a long, jagged scar across his knuckles. She disappeared a few days later. The sheriff said she just moved on. I told myself I believed him. I wanted to. Mercy was silent, watching him. So I reckon I owe that silence a debt, he finished. Is that why you're here? No, he said, meeting her gaze. I'm here because I saw someone bleeding in the dark, and for the first time in a long time, that was enough. She reached out, her fingers hovering in the air between them, not quite touching him, but closing the gap between her story and his. And then, a sound from outside, the crunch of boots on snow, heavy, deliberate. Both of them froze, their eyes locking in shared understanding. Mercy's face went pale. He's back. Maddox was on his feet in an instant, moving to the window, his movements silent and fluid. He pulled the rough curtain aside just a fraction of an inch, his breath caught in his throat. It wasn't just one rider. It was two. One wore a thick winter coat and a self-righteous smirk. The other wore a sheriff's star. Sheriff Tobin, Maddox muttered, and Thatch. Mercy's hand flew to her belly, a purely instinctual gesture, as if she could somehow shield her unborn child from the evil that was now standing on her doorstep. They won't knock, she whispered, her voice trembling. They'll just take him. Maddox moved fast. He blew out the single lantern, plunging the room into near darkness. He scooped a handful of snow from the jug and threw it onto the embers, dousing the fire until only a wisp of smoke remained. What are you doing? Making it harder for them to see. He moved back to the stove, his hand resting on the hatchet. Quiet as a shadow. They'll just break the door down. Let them try, he growled. Mercy struggled to sit up, her face a mask of desperation. You don't understand. Thatch has the whole town wrapped around his finger. He'll twist this. He'll say you kidnapped me. He'll say I'm crazy. Maddox looked back at her over his shoulder, and in the dim light, his face was carved from granite. Then let them come in here, in the dark, and explain to whatever god they pray to why they're dragging a woman in labor out into a blizzard. He looked down at the discarded chain on the floor. I've got a rope in my pack. If you want to be tied up again, if you want me to disappear and say I was never here, just say the word. Mercy stared at the chain, at the iron links that had held her captive. Then she looked at Maddox, at this stranger who had shown her more kindness in a few hours than she'd known in a year. No, she said, her voice ringing with a newfound clarity. I'm done letting other people write my story. Maddox gave a single sharp nod. In that moment, they were no longer a rescuer and a victim. They were two souls caught in the same storm, ready to face it together. Outside, the door handle rattled. A voice, thick with authority and impatience, boomed through the wood. Open up, Boone. We know you're in there. Maddox didn't move an inch. Mercy clutched the blanket to her chest and whispered, not to Maddox, but to the child safe inside her. We're almost there, baby. Just a little more storm to get through. The door didn't open. Not yet. But the silence that followed was louder and more terrifying than any shout. The men outside didn't break down the door. They were patient. Or maybe they were just waiting for more witnesses to their brand of justice. Inside the cabin was a pressure cooker. The air was thick with the scent of fear and smoke and impending birth. Maddox had rebuilt the fire but kept it low, a single defiant eye of orange staring into the oppressive gloom. Mercy's breathing had changed. It was no longer the slow, ragged rhythm of exhaustion. It was short, sharp, primal. She gritted her teeth, her hands clenched into fists on the thin mattress. It's starting again, she whispered, the words barely audible. Maddox was by her side, his presence a solid, unmoving anchor in the chaos. How far apart? I don't know, she gasped, her eyes squeezed shut. Time's all mixed up. It feels like the whole world is inside me, trying to claw its way out. He placed his hand over hers. It wasn't a comforting gesture. It was a statement. I am here. It's going to be rough, she said, her voice strained. I was told it's worse when you're afraid. I'll be here, he said again, and she gave a small, jerky nod, sweat beading on her forehead. Another contraction hit her like a physical blow. She cried out, stuffing a corner of the blanket in her mouth to muffle the sound. You can scream, Maddox told her, his voice low and steady. No, she panted. He'll hear. The pain crested, and her body arched off the mattress. The cabin felt like it was shrinking, the walls closing in, holding their breath along with her. Time ceased to have meaning. There was only the rhythm of her pain, the ragged sound of her breathing, and the low murmur of Maddox's voice, a steady, calming presence in the storm. The contractions came closer together, 3 minutes apart, then 2. Then there was no time between them at all, just one long, continuous wave of agony. You're doing fine, he said, though the words felt hollow and useless. You're strong. No, she gasped, her eyes wild. I'm angry. Good, he said, a grim smile touching his lips. Anger will get you through this. She tried to laugh, but it came out as a sob. The blizzard outside was nothing compared to the tempest raging inside this tiny room. It was a battle fought in blood and bone and breath. Don't let them take him, she whispered in a moment of clarity, her hand gripping his arm with surprising strength. They won't. Promise me, she begged, her eyes boring into his. If they get in, if I don't make it, you take him. You run. Maddox didn't hesitate. He looked her straight in the eye. If you don't make it, he said, his voice as cold and hard as the iron stove, I will bury this whole town in silence before I let them lay a hand on him. A different kind of tear tracked its way down her cheek then. It wasn't a tear of pain or fear, it was a tear of trust. Another contraction ripped through her, and she bore down, a guttural cry tearing from her throat. Maddox helped her sit forward, his movements clumsy but certain. He'd never done this before, not really, but he moved with the quiet competence of a man who had nothing left to lose by being gentle. She gripped his arm, her nails digging into his skin, but he didn't flinch. Almost there, he said, though he had no way of knowing if that was true. She was shaking violently now, her skin burning with fever. She pushed again, her body folding in on itself, a raw animal scream breaking from her lips. "I can feel him. I can feel his head," she gasped. "Good. You're close. One more push." She didn't answer. She just screamed, a full-throated, world-shattering sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin. And then, silence. A sudden, shocking stillness. It was followed by a wet, sliding sound. And then, a cry. A thin, piercing, utterly miraculous cry. Maddox blinked, his hands shaking as he held the tiny, slick infant. The umbilical cord still pulsed, a living connection between two worlds. Mercy collapsed back against the pillow, her body limp, her face streaked with tears and sweat, sobbing with relief. He's here." Maddox wrapped the baby in his own worn coat, his stoic facade cracking for the first time. His face softened, like a man hearing a song he thought he'd forgotten. "He's here," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "You did it." She reached out her trembling arms, and he carefully placed the baby in them. And in that moment, in the flickering firelight, Maddox witnessed something holy. A woman, battered and broken, smiling through the blood and the tears, holding a new life she had forged from sheer will and survival. "He's got my nose," she said, her laugh wet and shaky. "Poor thing." She looked up at Maddox, her eyes shining. "He's warm. He's got strong lungs. He's beautiful." Maddox had to turn away, pretending to busy himself with the fire, to hide the sudden moisture in his own eyes. He took the knife, now sterilized and glowing faintly, and with a steady hand he cut the cord, tying it off with a strip of clean linen. "You need to rest," he said. Mercy didn't argue. She just closed her eyes, her arms wrapped protectively around her son. The fire crackled. The storm had passed. A fragile peace settled over the small cabin. And then, a knock. Not on the door this time. A sharp, rapping sound on the window pane. Maddox moved instantly, throwing the blanket over Mercy and the child. He strode to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to see. Thatch. He was standing outside, alone, and in his hand, something glinted in the pale morning light. A revolver. Maddox stepped back from the window, his body a shield between the man outside and the woman on the bed. "He's here," he said, his voice a low growl. "Alone." Mercy's eyes snapped open, all traces of exhaustion gone, replaced by a fierce, protective fire. "Don't let him in." "I won't." She struggled to sit up, her movements slow but determined. A new strength seemed to be flowing into her. "You don't understand," she said urgently. "He'll say I'm mad. He'll say I tried to seduce him. He knows what the sheriff, what the whole town will believe." Maddox nodded grimly. He looked around the cabin, his eyes landing on the still smoldering embers. He scooped up a cup of water and poured it over them, sending a thick plume of smoke billowing up towards the ceiling. Then he walked to the door and pulled it open. Thatch stood there, the gun held loosely at his side, a practiced look of concern on his face. "Boone," he said, his voice smooth as oil, "I didn't think you were the kind to harbor fugitives." "I'm not," Maddox said, blocking the doorway with his body. "Then step aside. That woman is a danger to herself and her child." Maddox didn't move. Thatch's eyes narrowed. "She's lied to you, my friend. That girl can spin more tales than a spider in a barn. She'll ruin you, just like she tried to ruin me." "Is that what she did?" Maddox asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "When you chained her to a stove?" Thatch's smile wavered for a fraction of a second. "She's unstable. She told me she was going to kill the child. I had to restrain her for her own good. She nearly died giving birth last night." Thatch shrugged, a casual, dismissive gesture. That's not my fault. The woman is weak. Maddox took a half step forward. You want to try explaining that to a jury? Thatch laughed, a confident, booming sound. There isn't a jury in this territory that won't take the word of a man of God over a runaway hysteric. He raised the gun, leveling it at Maddox's chest. I don't want to hurt you, Boone. Just give me my son, and you can walk away. You already hurt me, Maddox said, his eyes like chips of ice. Last time I stayed quiet. I let the whispers win. Not this time. A soft cry came from behind Maddox. Mercy was standing there, pale and trembling, but on her feet. She held the baby, wrapped in Maddox's coat, tightly to her chest. Her eyes were fixed on Thatch, blazing with a righteous fury. You want him? She said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the tension like a knife. Come and get him. Thatch hesitated, his confidence faltering for the first time. He's yours, isn't he? She continued, taking a step forward. That's what you told everyone. But you left me here to die. You called me a liar. You left me to give birth in the dark like a dog. Maddox saw Thatch's hand tremble slightly on the grip of the revolver. He wasn't used to being challenged. He wasn't used to his victims fighting back. Mercy took another step, her voice rising with every word. If you take him now, if you pull that trigger, the whole town will hear the rest of the story. Maybe they won't believe me, but they'll whisper. And you will never preach another sermon. You will never hold a Bible in your hands again without someone in the crowd remembering the woman you tried to break. Thatch looked from Mercy's defiant face to the silent, watching form of Maddox, and then to the small bundle in her arms. People forget, he spat. I won't, Maddox said, his voice a solemn vow. And I've got nothing left to lose. The silence stretched, thin and tight. Then, with a curse, Thatch lowered the gun. He slid it back into its holster. This isn't over, he snarled. She's still a danger. No, Maddox said, stepping aside to let Mercy back into the warmth of the cabin. She's a mother. Thatch stared at them for a moment longer, his face a twisted mask of hatred, and then he turned and stalked back into the trees. The door clicked shut behind him, the sound echoing the finality of a closing coffin lid. The snow fell thick and fast, covering Thatch's retreating footsteps, trying to bury the ugly truth under a blanket of pure, clean white. But Mercy knew. She stood just inside the doorway, the cold air raising goosebumps on her bare arms, and she didn't take a full breath until the dark shape of him was completely swallowed by the forest. Maddox gently closed the door. You should rest, he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. I can't, she whispered, her eyes still fixed on the spot where Thatch had disappeared. Not while he's still out there, breathing. The baby made a soft, snuffling sound against her chest. She looked down at his tiny, perfect face and kissed the top of his head. Her own face had changed. The fear was gone, burned away by the fires of labor and confrontation. What was left was something stronger, something truer. Maddox stood by the window, his gaze sweeping the silent woods. He knew men like Thatch. They didn't accept defeat. They regrouped. Cowards never fought their own battles. They always brought a posse to do their bleeding for them. He didn't have to wait long. By mid-morning, the sound came again, the rhythmic crunch of boots on snow, slow and purposeful. This wasn't a man running or hiding. This was a man used to being obeyed. Sheriff Tobin. This time he didn't bother knocking. But Maddox was ready. He opened the door just as the sheriff raised his hand. Tobin looked momentarily surprised, like a man who expects to find a mouse and finds a wolf instead. Well now, the sheriff said, his tone dripping with false pleasantry. Ain't this a cozy little scene? Maddox stood his ground, a silent sentinel in the doorway. Tobin was a big man, his brown coat damp and heavy, his face permanently fixed in a look that was half tired, half smug. He held a folded piece of paper in his gloved hand. "You've got her in there, Boone," he stated, not asked. "I do. She's under investigation." "She's recovering from childbirth," Maddox countered, his voice flat. Tobin shifted his considerable weight from one foot to the other. "Look, Thatch came to me this morning, filed a formal complaint, said she seduced him, then threatened to kill his unborn child. Said she went mad with grief and ran off. Says you're holding her here against her will." "She was chained to that stove when I found her," Maddox said, his eyes boring into the sheriff. "You want to write that part down in your report?" "Got no proof of that, just your word against a respected man of God." "I've got her word too. She's got you wrapped around her little finger, Boone. Always was good at that." Maddox took a step forward, not threatening, but making his presence felt. "Her name is Mercy. She's a mother, and she's telling the truth." Tobin let out a long, weary sigh, his breath fogging in the cold air. "This town doesn't much care about the truth, Maddox. It cares about peace. And Thatch, for all his faults, he keeps the peace. He's a liar. He's also got half the town in his pocket. Good, church-going folk. They'll stand with him long before they'll stand with a woman who disappeared into the woods and came back with blood on her dress and a bastard in her arms." "So you're going to charge her?" Maddox asked, his voice dangerously low. Tobin actually shook his head. "No, I'm going to give her a trial. A town hearing. Isn't that what you want? A chance for her to speak her piece." "She's not strong enough to walk to town." "Then I'll come back tomorrow. I'll bring the preacher and old Fern from the council. Let her tell her side of the story in front of witnesses. But I'm warning you, Boone. If the town doesn't like what it hears, I can't stop them from deciding what justice looks like." Maddox stared at the sheriff for a long, hard moment, reading the cowardice and compromise in the man's eyes. Then he gave a single curt nod. "I'll have her ready." Tobin tipped his hat, a gesture devoid of any real respect, and walked away, his boots leaving deep, confident prints in the snow. As the door closed, the baby started to cry. Mercy had been listening from the bed, and her face was a pale, stoic mask. "They'll never believe me," she said, her voice flat with resignation. "Then we'll make them," Maddox said. "What's the point? They've already made up their minds." "Because right now," Maddox said, kneeling beside her, "they're the only ones telling your story. This is how you take it back." She didn't cry, but her hand trembled as she stroked her son's tiny foot. "What if they try to take him from me?" "They won't. You don't know that." "Yes, I do," he said, his voice a low, fierce promise. "Because I'll be there, and I don't give a damn about their peace. I care about the truth." The room fell quiet, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was the calm before the flood, the moment the wind dies and you can feel the ground begin to tremble. That night they took turns watching, one sleeping while the other stood guard. Mercy fed her baby, her movements slow and deliberate, her eyes full of a fierce, desperate love. Maddox sat by the fire, sharpening the blade of the hatchet. Not because he planned to use it, but because the familiar scrape of steel on stone was a comforting sound, a reminder that some things could still be given an edge. Just before dawn, a sleigh crunched to a halt outside. 3 figures emerged from the morning mist. Sheriff Tobin, old Fern with her sour, pinched face, and the town preacher, a man who always looked like he was apologizing for taking up space. They didn't bother to knock. Fern carried a notebook and a pen, her face impassive. The preacher clutched a Bible he never seemed to open. Mercy sat on the edge of the bed, straight and proud, the baby wrapped in the last clean cloth they had. "All right," Tobin said, his voice businesslike. Let's hear it." Mercy met his gaze, and without fear, without hesitation, she began to speak. She told them everything. Not just the horror, not just the chain and the fear. She told them about the beginning, about how Thatch's kindness had felt like a lifeline in her grief. She told them how the help slowly turned into control, how the protection became a cage. She told them how she fled with nothing but the clothes on her back and the hope that she could raise her child in a world that wasn't poisoned by his lies. Fern's pen scratched across the paper, the only sound in the room. The preacher cleared his throat. Tobin stared at a spot on the floor. When she finished, her voice raw but steady, Maddox stood up. "I saw the chain," he said, his voice ringing with authority. "I cut her loose. I delivered her child. And I am not going to let this town bury this story the way they buried the last one." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "A lot of people aren't going to like this." "The truth isn't always likable," Maddox shot back. Fern finally looked up from her notebook, her eyes like two chips of slate. "If the town votes to have the child placed in fosterage, will you try to stop them, Mr. Boone?" Maddox didn't even blink. "Yes." The preacher frowned, his brow furrowed with disapproval. "Are you willing to sign on as the child's legal guardian, to take responsibility?" Maddox looked at Mercy. She didn't speak, but her arms tightened around the baby. "I am," Maddox said. Fern made a final decisive mark in her notebook. "The town will hear this testimony. There will be whispers. There will be judgment. Some people won't forget what's been said." Mercy spoke then, her voice quiet but unshakable. "Let them remember. Maybe next time they'll be better." Tobin stood up, eager to leave. "We'll hold a town vote. Tomorrow at the meeting hall. You can come if you want. Or don't. Either way, the town will decide." As they filed out of the cabin, Maddox placed a hand on Mercy's shoulder. "You told them." "I did, and they listened." "Some of them did," she said, her eyes following the sleigh as it disappeared into the trees. "I suppose that's enough." She didn't say anything more. She just held her son close and watched as the snow began to fall again, soft and silent, covering the tracks of the sleigh, but not the truth that had finally been spoken. The old meeting hall smelled of wet wool, cheap lamp oil, and the kind of tension that makes it hard to breathe. It wasn't a church anymore, but the ghosts of old sermons still clung to the rafters. Every bench was full. Farmers, merchants, their wives, all of them gathered not to hear the truth, but to confirm the verdict they'd already reached in their hearts. Maddox stood by the door, his arms crossed over his chest. He was a stone wall, a silent promise. He wasn't there to make a speech. He was there to bear witness. Then Mercy walked in. The room fell silent. She held her son bundled against her chest, her chin held high. She wore no coat, no shawl to hide behind. Her boots were scuffed, her dress was plain, but her eyes were clear and bright with a fire they couldn't quench. The whole town turned to stare, and for a moment the silence was so profound it felt like a sound in itself. It was the sound of collective guilt. At the front of the hall, Sheriff Tobin, Old Fern, and the preacher sat behind a long table. A stack of blank ballot sheets sat between them like a pile of accusations. "She'll be allowed to speak," Tobin announced to the room. "But there will be no theatrics. This is official town business." Mercy didn't wait to be called. She walked to the center of the room, her footsteps echoing on the bare floorboards. The baby stirred in her arms, as if he knew his entire future was being weighed in this cold, hostile room. "I was tied to a stove," she began, her voice ringing out, clear and strong. "Left to give birth alone in the dark, and still I brought my son into this world with love in my hands." The hush in the room deepened. There is a power in a mother's voice that can silence even the most stubborn fool, especially when it isn't asking for pity, but demanding respect. I didn't come here today to beg for your mercy, she continued, her eyes sweeping across their faces. I came here to tell you the truth you were too comfortable to see. The truth that a man you welcomed into your homes came into mine like a thief. I bled alone in a blizzard while you listened to the pretty lies of a man who wouldn't know God if he sat down next to him on that bench. Fern's pen scratched furiously on the paper. Tobin stared at his hands. The preacher nervously adjusted his collar. I am not here to be judged by you, Mercy said, her voice rising. Because I have done nothing wrong. Maddox stepped forward then, moving to stand just behind her, a silent, unshakable support. Neither have I, he said, his voice a low rumble that carried to the back of the hall. But I did once. I stayed quiet once, when a girl's life was on the line. I let a town like this one choose comfort over courage. She disappeared. No grave, no marker. Just silence. I've had to live with that silence every day since. He looked from Mercy's proud profile to the sea of uncertain faces before him. So this time, I'm standing. Tobin cleared his throat, eager to regain control. You've both had your say. The town will now cast its vote. But before he could continue, a hand went up in the back of the room. A figure rose and walked slowly down the central aisle. It was Thatch. He held his hat in his hands, his face a perfect mask of humility and sorrow. I did not want to speak today, he said, his voice filled with a practiced, pious grief. I did not want to air this private shame in public, but I cannot stand by and allow these vicious lies to poison this good town. He stopped directly in front of Mercy, his eyes full of false pity. That child she is holding, he is my son. I offered her a home, a name, my protection. But she is unwell. Her grief has twisted her mind. I never laid a hand on her. I swear it on my mother's grave. I came here today to do the right thing, to claim my son and see that he is raised in a proper Christian home. Mercy's arms tightened around her baby. She threatened to harm the child, Thatch continued, his voice breaking with emotion. She said she would rather see him dead than let him be a burden to her. I only restrained her to protect him, to protect my own son. Maddox started to move, a low growl building in his chest, but Mercy's voice cut through the air, sharp as a shard of glass. Tell them what you tied me with, she demanded. Thatch paused, caught off guard. A simple cooking chain. Where was it bolted to the wall? He faltered. To the back of the stove, I believe. What color was the blanket on the bed? He blinked, his composure starting to crack. I don't recall. What color are his eyes? Mercy pressed, her voice trembling now, not with fear, but with righteous fury. Thatch's mouth opened and closed like a fish on a hook. He had no answer. You never held him, she said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. You never even saw him, because he was never yours to claim, and even if he were, no man has the right to chain a woman to a stove and then pretend he is worthy of being a father. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Someone whispered. The tide of opinion was beginning to turn. Thatch saw it. He saw his power, his influence, slipping away. And in his desperation, he made his final, fatal mistake. His hand darted inside his coat. There was a glint of blued steel. A pistol. A woman in the front row screamed. Maddox lunged forward, but he was too slow. But someone else was faster. With a speed that belied his size, Sheriff Tobin was on his feet. There was a sharp crack, like a dry branch snapping. Tobin had brought his heavy fist down on Thatch's wrist, sending the pistol skittering across the floorboards. The room was plunged into a shocked, absolute silence. Tobin looked down at the cowering Thatch, his face filled with a disgust that was, for the first time, completely genuine. Then he looked out at the stunned faces of the townspeople. "That's enough," he said, his voice heavy with a weariness that went beyond just this one day. "That's more than enough." No one moved. No one spoke. Then a woman at the edge of the crowd stood up. She looked at Mercy, gave a single slow nod of respect, and then turned to face her neighbors. "She told her truth," the woman said, her voice clear and steady. "And that's more than most of us ever do." Another man stood, then another. One by one, the people who had come to condemn Mercy rose to their feet in a silent testament of support. Thatch was hauled out of the hall, his head hanging in shame, no longer a preacher, just a small, pathetic man stripped of all his lies. Fern didn't say a word. She simply took the stack of blank ballots and tore them in half. The vote was over before it had even begun. The sheriff looked at Mercy. "No charges," he said. "She stays. The child stays with her. You all go home and think on that." Maddox let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Mercy didn't cry. She just held her son and rocked him gently, as if the storm had finally, truly passed. That evening, back in the small cabin, the fire burned bright and warm. Outside, the snow fell in fat, gentle flakes, blanketing the world in a quiet peace. Mercy was feeding the baby, a look of serene contentment on her face. She looked up at Maddox, who was staring into the flames. "Why did you stay?" she asked softly. He was quiet for a long moment, watching the embers glow. "Because I was tired," he said, "of letting bad men have the loudest voices." She nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "Will you go now?" He looked at her, at the child in her arms, at the small, safe world they had carved out of the storm. He shook his head. "Not unless you ask me to." "I won't," she said. The fire burned low, the child slept, and outside, under the pale, silent moon, the world kept turning. It hadn't changed. But here, in this one small corner of it, a little piece of it had been healed. Some people will tell you that justice comes riding in on a fast horse, with guns blazing and a thunderous voice. But I saw it arrive on quiet, snow-worn feet, with nothing but the truth in a woman's heart. And if you ask me, the hardest things to bury aren't the bodies of our dead. They're the stories we tried so hard not to hear. But once a story like that is told, the world doesn't get to forget it. If you believe that one person's courage can change the world, even just a small piece of it, then do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. You never know when you'll need to hear a story that reminds you to stand up and speak out.